Hello there, everyone. Happy Halloween. I hope your day is going wonderful. Today I have a compilation of spooky stories for you to celebrate All Hallows Eve. I hope you enjoy. The credits will be in the description below. Please like and subscribe to get this video out and leave a comment saying how you enjoyed it if you did. Now, without further ado, let's get started, shall we? Always check your kids' Halloween candy. Written by PriestessOfSpiders on Reddit. Everyone knows the horror stories. Razor blades, hallucinogens, rat poison, all disguised in candy, just waiting for innocent kids to gobble them up. It's all nonsense, of course. Sure, there are a few isolated incidents where some sicko does something like that, but the whole tainted candy myth is an enormous exaggeration at best. No, the reason I say you should check your kids' candy is very, very different. It was the Halloween of '09. I was only 14. I was on the cusp of being ever so slightly too old for it to be socially acceptable to go trick-or-treating, so I aimed to make that night my biggest haul yet. My costume was elaborate, a zombie with a full face mask, claw gloves, and a chest piece that would drip fake blood at the push of a button. I learned from experience that the more detailed a costume, the more candy you get. I was going to hit every house I could. I expected to get so much that I even bought one of those big black garbage bags to hold the candy in. I was going to make it a night to remember. But not for the reasons I had hoped. I couldn't tell you which house I got it from. That's something that has always bugged me. My bag was so full, and I visited so many houses, that it was all just a blur. At the end of the night, I was sorting my candy into piles. A small mound of chocolate bars, some plastic wrapped in gummy candies, dozens of lollipops, and more. As I reached into the central pile of unsorted candy, I found something quite unusual. It looked like a chocolate bar of some sort, but one I had never seen before. The wrapper was a greenish yellow in coloration, with a two-armed cartoon worm giving a thumbs up and winking. The label was in some other language, the symbols not corresponding to any Latin letters that I recognized. At first I thought it was maybe in Russian, but the script wasn't quite right. I'd seen what Cyrillic characters looked like in some video games and movies, and this looked a little bit different. Raising an eyebrow, I opened the wrapper, curious to see what was inside. It looked like my initial guess was right. It did seem to be a chocolate bar of some sort, with little white orbs embedded in its surface, kind of like how some candies had pieces of nuts. I gave it a bite and was pleasantly surprised to find that it was utterly delicious. To this day, I think it was one of the best chocolate bars I've had in my entire life. Being a 14-year-old, I didn't have the best impulse control. I gobbled the whole thing down in about 30 seconds, tossing the wrapper aside and searching for more in the pile of unsorted candy. I didn't find any more, however, and resigned myself to disappointment. I figured I would ask around at school, bringing the wrapper to see if anyone else had gotten lucky. Maybe I could offer some of my less enticing candy as trade. After finishing my sorting and eating a few more pieces of candy, I finally headed off to sleep, my stomach full and my heart happy. It had been a great day. The next morning, I made sure to pack the empty chocolate wrapper so I could ask around at school, and bought some extra candy for trade. During recess at lunch, I asked nearly the whole school about the chocolate, but I only found 3 other people who got one. And they, like me, had immediately eaten the whole thing. I still remember their names. Jeremy, a lanky, bespectacled kid from chemistry class. Ashley, a girl with dyed blue hair, who I'd seen around but never really talked to. And Lee, a track and field athlete, who I share math class with. They all agreed that it was by far the best chocolate they'd ever had, and had also been hoping to find some more. However, it seemed like the trail ended there. None of them remembered which house gave them the chocolate bar either. It was a little sad, but ultimately it wasn't the end of the world for me. It was just a candy bar after all. It took me a few weeks to notice anything strange. I had long since forgotten about the candy bar, and now that Halloween had come and gone, it was back to the daily routine of school and homework. One morning I woke up to find myself feeling very thirsty. It felt like I had been walking in the desert for days, so I immediately got up to get something to drink. Normally with breakfast I would have milk or orange juice, but that day I decided I would just have a big glass of water, and then another, and then another. After 3 glasses, I was finally satisfied me. My mom eyed me with an eye of confusion. "Feeling a little bit dehydrated, honey?" she asked. I nodded, a little embarrassed. "I'm not sure why. I just felt really thirsty this morning," I responded. She smiled and said smugly, "Well, at least it's not soda or energy drinks. Those things will rot your teeth, you know." I rolled my eyes and finished my breakfast, getting ready for school and bringing the bottles of water with me. That day during chemistry class, our teacher announced that Friday there would be a school day-long field trip to the local lake, where a fish and wildlife representative would talk to us about the native ecosystem and the environmental impact of pollution. It was not mandatory, but students who went and wrote a paper about it would get extra credit. The teacher said anyone who wanted to go should raise their hand, and instantly I found myself raising mine. Jeremy did too, and I detected the faintest hint of confusion on his face. I also felt a little bewildered. I had never really been particularly interested in the environmentalism or anything like that, and it's not like I needed the extra credit. But something about the field trip seemed to call to me, like I was meant to go there. The rest of the week passed agonizingly slow. I found myself constantly thinking about the lake, about its cool green waters, rippling gently in the breeze. Every morning I would wake up thirstier than the last, until my mom was starting to grow concerned about my water intake. I bought one of those huge water bottles that athletes used, and I noticed that Jeremy and Ashley had as well. Lee already had one, but I noticed him drinking from it more often than normal in math class. Finally, Friday came around, and the small number of students going to the lake got into the school bus. I couldn't help but notice Lee and Ashley were coming too, but I was quickly distracted by the thought of the lake. I'd never been one for water. It was fun to go to the pool once in a while, but I'd never been obsessed over it. However, all I could think of during the bus ride to the lake about how good it would feel to just dive into the shimmering water, to sink all the way to the bottom and stay there, surrounded by fish. When we finally arrived, the Fish and Wildlife guy had us all sit down on the grass. He told us about pH levels, showed us a preserved frog with too many legs, and passed around photos of some of the garbage he found on the water's edge. I was not paying attention though. I was just staring out at that lake, hypnotized by its gentle waves. I thought about how nice it would feel on my skin and in my mouth. Before I knew it, what I was doing, I was standing up, walking towards the lake. I could faintly hear the chaperone yelling at me to come back, and some of the other students murmuring in confusion, but I wasn't focused on that. It was just background noise. The sounds of the lake filled my ears. I was vaguely aware that I wasn't alone in my march towards the lake. Jeremy, Ashley, and Lee were all walking with me, similarly fixated. I felt my tennis shoes sink into the cold water as we kept walking onwards. As I kept moving, the water went up to my knees, and then my thighs, and then my waist, my chest, and then my neck. Finally, my head was fully submerged, and I looked out into the murky gloom, not even trying to hold my breath as I inhaled the lake water. Then came the sudden realization of what was happening, where I was. It was as if I had been a puppet whose strings were suddenly cut. I was fully aware of the fact that I was drowning, and then came the pain. I could feel wriggling under my skin, a burning, itching pain like needles shooting up from inside my flesh. I looked down and saw long, pallid worms erupt out of my skin like moles, digging out from the earth. I tried to scream, my mouth once again flooding with water, as one of them squirmed out from underneath my eyelid. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all came writhing up as they burrowed through my flesh. The pain was unbearable, and my vision started to fade to black as I passed out from a combination of agony, terror, and a lack of oxygen. I woke up in the hospital, my parents standing over me, their eyes filled with concern. I felt so tired, but thankfully not thirsty at all. When they realized I was awake, my mom smothered me with hugs and kisses, while my dad just started sobbing with relief. I asked about the others, the 3 students who went into the lake with me, but they didn't make it. There was only time to rescue one of us. The doctors were at a loss to explain the puncture wounds all over my body, and I said it wasn't anything too severe, and that I should be able to recover with some pain medicine and antibiotics. I did not tell them about the worms. I knew I would not be believed anyway, and I didn't want to end up locked away in some institution. I already had to have therapy sessions, and got put on some antidepressants. Apparently, the authorities cooked up some story about an unaliving pact between Jeremy, Ashley, Lee, and I. I played along with the story to the therapist, talking about feeling overwhelmed at school and whatnot, but it was all nonsense. I was not depressed in the least, not before this happened. I did some independent research trying to figure out what happened to me, and what I found was startling. There is a phylum of worm called Nemamorpha, also known as horsehair worms. They typically infect insects, growing inside them and controlling their central nervous system to make them jump into the water and drown. Once the host leaps into the water, the worm burrows its way out of the host, continuing its life aquatically to find a mate and lay eggs. There are a few cases of accidental infection of humans, but there is no recorded evidence of them ever manipulating a mammal the way they control insects. I also found something else out. A few weeks after Halloween, every year, like clockwork, there is a spike in child deaths due to drowning. It is not enough to be noticed by most people, but it is obvious once you're looking for it. So I'll say it to you again. Always check your kids' Halloween candy. If you find a greenish-yellow chocolate bar with writing in a language you've never seen before, don't let them eat it, no matter what. The Gray of Sunset, written by Eurytris, on Reddit. It happened when I was on my way home from the flea market across state lines. I sell things I make out of junk mostly. The term is trash sculptures in the community I belong to, but I never liked that term. Some may call them junk, but to me, they are treasures. I make all kinds of things from the stuff I find at the dump. People, vehicles, animals, whatever catches my eye. They sell pretty good, but not in my home state. I usually end up driving to Sadie's Flea Market, one of these huge sprawling outdoor markets in Alabama, to sell my wares. The people there love them, and today was the first time in a while I have come back with anything. I was loading the sitter into the back of my truck as the sun went down. I had made him out of rebar and old license plates, and he was definitely unique looking. I'd had some lookers, but he was a little heavy for my usual crowd. The sitter is an end-of-day purchase, to be sure, and no one was buying him today. I sat him in the back of the truck and grinned as he sort of looked like he was sitting there, just resting in the truck bed after a long day of being on display. With my passenger secured, I cleaned up my stall and rolled out the parking lot just as it started to get dark. The road was busy, but not overly so. It's about an hour to my house through some pretty rural countryside. I never minded. It's pretty soothing view as you roll along through the Florida and Alabama line. Most of the route is roadside stands, abandoned buildings, gas stations, and the ever-popular fireworks stand. It's hard to explain, but it always seemed so desolate out there. A single pole light shining beside the shell of an abandoned house. An old store that's slowly being retaken by the woods. They were little things that reminded me that humanity had once had hope for these out-of-the-way places, and made me wish I had the skill to use a camera properly. Some artistic type would probably have paid a mint for pictures of some of these things. As I drove, I saw other people getting ready to leave the shops and businesses along the highway. The setting sun seemed to wash them out in a way that's hard to explain. It's strange, but the sunset grayed them, making them look like actors in an early 90s show. It seemed to bleed all the colors out of them, and it's kind of nostalgic for me. It always seemed oh so comfortable. Until today, that is. As I drove for the state line, the sun turned the trees into a fiery corona, a forest fire that burned on until it was snuffed out with the eventual setting of the sun. It started rather subtly. I had chalked it up to the sun having gone down when I first noticed it, but as I drove past a familiar barn, I had to double take. The barn was old, older than me probably, but it looked like something was drawn like in a sketchbook. It was hard to put into words, but it just looked flat and unfinished. As I watched, the light on the barn threw only a small circle of illumination, and the yard itself looked grainy and unreal. I watched as a cat walked under that light, and he seemed to be made of graphite lines that had learned to move all on their own. I rubbed at my eyes as I rolled along, pretty sure I was just tired. I had been making sculptures and putting together today's pieces all week, and I was probably just starting to feel the strain. A little sleep was all I needed, and once I got home, I could start burning my candle at both ends again tomorrow. The sitter could sit in my truck till I woke up tomorrow morning, and I'd have added another 2 or 3 pieces by next Saturday. I didn't think much of it as I rolled along until I saw the other houses. The farther I drove, the harder it was to just ignore the strange change in the landscape. I drove past the trailer park and could see all the gray lead outlines as the windows glowed. The insides looked like they were being lit by bug zappers, that harsh fluorescent light making them seem to crackle. The spotlights were made the concrete look like pores, almost holy, and the dog resting out front had looked like he were to bark, it would come out in word bubbles. It was all very surreal, and I had to look down at my own hands in order to discover whether I, too, looked like a pencil sketch. I was pleased to find my normal level of realness, and just kept driving as I tried to get past whatever I had driven into. It didn't get bad until I came to the stoplight. There's only one stoplight before you get to the state line. It's probably there to allow people leaving the gas station or the liquor store to get back onto the highway so they don't get creamed. The gas station only had a single light over the pumps, but the inside looked welcoming. It reminded me of that painting, the one of dead celebrities in the drawer, and I was half tempted to turn in when something whooshed up to my left, and I turned to see a fire going to the side of the liquor store. It wasn't much more than a one-room building that sold beer and wine. I had driven past the pink stucco building 1,000 times, but it had an evil look tonight. It didn't glow like its trailers or the gas station, and its face was dark and brooding as the glass reflected to the side of it. It seemed the antithesis of the gas station, and sitting across the street from each other, they almost seemed adversarial. The cars in the parking lot were the old rusty sort, pickups, the dark-colored Cadillacs, and the long cigar-shaped constructs. They seemed to hunch around the lot like gargoyles, but as the fire began to build, I noticed the strange people that were feeding it. The store had a cage beside it, something the employees fill with cardboard boxes and trash, then burn when it gets too full. I watched as the human-shaped creatures threw boxes onto the flames. Others simply standing around as they watched the fire in exaltation. The people weren't even approximations of people. They looked like a child's idea of what human shapes would be. The bodies bulbous, and the heads looking lumpy. Their arms were muscled, and their legs disproportionately squat. They looked like orcs in a Lord of the Rings book, and just looking at them made me a little uneasy. They were supposed to be human, but I'd never seen anything less human in my life. They looked like natives in an old jungle picture, dancing around a flaming idol, and as I watched, I saw one of them notice me. I glanced back to the light, but it was hard to tell what color it was. All three were shades of gray, and as they flipped through, I couldn't tell what I was supposed to do. Something moved in front of the grainy flame, drawing my attention back to the liquor store. The four of them froze as they saw I had noticed them. their red eyes glaring as they prepared to run in on my truck. Red or green, I did not care. I put my focus on the gas and blew through the intersection, rolling up the road as the 4 lumpy humanoids watched me go. My tires squealed as we flew up the blacktop. The trees and buildings we passed and began to pulsate a little, their lead edges cracking like lightning. The whole thing looked like a Tex Avery cartoon, something from a sketchbook, nightmare skit with the old show, and the longer I watched the sky, the less I cared about the road, my eyes glued to that fuzzy space, the graphite lighting sending a phosphorescent clarity through my steely gray sky. Something was rising up amongst the clouds, a silver orb of a moon that suddenly and unexpectedly filled me with fear. Then it rolled in the sky, and I was suddenly looking at the eye of some great beast. It swam in that inky space, this perfect orb, and when it found me, I began to shake. The eye looked straight at me, fixing me with its gaze, not blinking as its regard bore into me, and I found myself unable to look away. When the harsh lights and the equally harsh horn invaded my space, I continued to be aware of nothing but the blinking moon. Then, suddenly, everything went dark, and I was left floating in the inky blackness, until a beeping brought me back to the waking world. I was in a hospital, arms aching from the RV, and head pounding from the wound that had likely landed me here. My sister had been playing on her phone, but she looked up when I started groaning back to consciousness. She stopped me from getting up, and I realized that I only saw her out of one eye. Thankfully, the other one was covered in bandages, but at the time, it was pretty jarring. My sister filled me in and said she was glad that I had come out, because no one understood what had happened. According to the man in the moving truck, the one I had scared half to death, I had crossed into his lane as he was driving back to the depot. He had swerved, barely avoiding my truck, and as I left the road, he saw someone slip out of the back and fall onto the concrete. I had proceeded into the nearby woods before a tree stopped my progress. It wasn't until he went to check on my passenger that he realized it was a dented metal doll and went to check on me. He had helped me get out of the truck and stayed with me till the ambulance came. Then I spent the next 4 days in a coma. I don't know what happened, I can't even really explain it. But somehow, I slipped into something very different. The road I'd come to know was not what I drove that night, and I suddenly found myself in a place that I couldn't come to terms with. I tried to tell people that, but they didn't seem to believe that I might have been drugged, or maybe I'd been picked up by something I couldn't handle at the flea market. They never found anything heavier than Xanax in my system, though. My sister floated the idea that I fell asleep and had a dream before I drove off the road. But I know what I saw. I saw those things, and I'm lucky to have escaped them. So if you're driving the highways of America, be on the lookout for pockets of strangers. And by God, good luck to you if you happen to see one.
Blurbles from Beyond, written by Eurytris. Link to the original story will be in the description below. Now, without further ado, let's get started, shall we? We recently moved into our new house. It's perfect, just the right size for our family, but it has a strange problem with the drains. I noticed it while I was unpacking from the bathroom things. I turned to find that my husband had forgotten to flush and pushed the lever to flush it down. When I did, I discovered that the sink burbles when you flush the toilet. Nothing too jarring, but it scared me a little when I first heard it. The sink burbles and bubbles, making a noise deep in the drain as it clears the water. My husband laughed it off when I mentioned it to him.
It's an old house, dear. The pipes are on a central line that feeds into the septic tank. No one has used them in a while, so it's probably just getting used to people being in the house again. I blew it off as a weird thing in the house, and just went about my business. A week later, the drain started burbling when I took a shower too. I overlooked it though, not wanting to dwell on something I ultimately couldn't do anything about. This was the first place I had lived with a septic tank. I'd always used city water, and I figured it was just something that happened with septic tanks. My husband barely seemed to notice it, so I assumed it was nothing out of the ordinary. After a few weeks, I had almost come to ignore it, until the whispering started. I was brushing my teeth one night, running my water as I always did, when I heard the burbling coming from the drain again. I had bent my mouth to the stream to get a mouthful of water when I could have sworn I heard a burbling kind of whisper from the drain. It was barely audible, more like a gurgle from the drain, but as I listened, it almost sounded like words. Back, bank, bees, back, bank, bees. I turned off the water, spitting my mouthful of paste and water down the drain, and closed the door behind me. The bubbling got worse from there on out. It didn't just bubble when the water was on. It always bubbled loud and jarring. I was still certain I couldn't hear the whispers. My husband shrugged it off as normal. He was busy with work and didn't have time to indulge his flighty wife. I put up with it as best I could, but it had honestly started to grate on me a bit. I heard it in the kitchen, the living room, and especially whenever I had to go to the bathroom. The bathroom seemed to be the epicenter, and as the days progressed, I became more and more confident I could hear words in the gurgles. I lost my cool one night when my husband was working late. As I lay in bed, my son sleeping soundly next to me, I could hear the sink burbling and whispering from the whole bathroom. The bubbles were visible now when it burbled, deep green bubbles that sloshed up the drain and filled the sink with stagnant water sometimes. Never when my husband was home, of course, and that bastard didn't believe me when I showed him the thin film that hung on the bowl. As I lay there listening, the gurgling seemed to mock me. It seemed like only I could hear it, and the continued surge of tidal forces had frazzled me. I was up before I really knew what I was doing. I stomped down the hall in my pajamas, heading for the bathroom on my bare feet. I was mad. I had had enough. And as I slammed the door open, I saw the towel rack shake ominously. I flipped on the light like I intended to catch the sink doing something wrong, and shouted loud enough to make my son stir and cry out in his sleep. "Shut up, shut up, shut up right now!" I screamed at the burbling sink. And for a wonder, it did. The drain starts burbling, and for a few seconds, there was peace. Then a geyser erupted from the drain and splashed high enough to splatter the ceiling in a green fountain. It splattered the walls, pattered against the shower curtain, and caused the ceiling to rain drops of thick sludge.
I'd fallen to my backside in the hallway, watching the geyser with wide eyes, when I found something loop out of the drain that made me scream. I scuttled across the floor, my back hitting the bedroom floor, hearing my son cry out in the bedroom. I had seen the last thing I would have ever expected from the narrow bathroom drain. And I was certain now that I could hear something else joining it as it gurgled onto the bathroom floor. A hand of sludgy green liquid that had punched from the drain like an angry hurricane. I reached with numb fingers for the knob, the fingers refusing to find purchase as I slapped at it uselessly. I heard a gurgly thunk, then the sound of water trying to maintain a shape it was unaccustomed to, and something cast a shadow against the door. The best way I can describe it is the shadow appeared to be cast by a living jello mold. It was solid, but it was transparent. It cast a watery shadow from its undulating as it came towards the door. A single green watery hand gripped the door frame. I screamed again as it lumbered into the hallway. My grasping hand felt like a dead fish. It was 6 feet tall, bulbous and amorphous, with a shuddering bald head. Its eyes were murky green coals, and its form was a wiggling mass of barely contained fluid. The fluid was... It was awful. It had clearly drawn its matter from the septic tank, and things floated within the water that doesn't bear thinking about. It took a single, unsure step, the unstable golem shaking as it took another tottering step. My son was screaming now, unsure of where I was, and his terror only amplified my fear. As it wobbled towards me, leaving puddles of oozing liquid in the hole, I heard the burbling voice again as its whisper wailed its words. Back, bees, back, bees. I tried again to open the door, my eyes locked in terror with the watery monstrosity. Back, bees, bees. I felt my own water puddle on the floor as my bladder let go, the creature towering over me. Back, bees, I yelled. It leaned down over me, and I could feel the stagnant drops fall on my face. I wanted to cover my nose. It smelled like raw sewage, but I was too afraid to move. I was sure at that moment that I would never see my husband again. He would return to find me dead and our son dead in our bed. He would never see the water and would always wonder what happened to us. As the creature crouched over me, I was certain that was the last thing I would see, and it would be this terrible sewage creature. It bent its watery lips to my face, and when it whispered this time, I could hear something different. Check tank, please. The words were spoken as though they might break the creature, and they were spoken with the utmost emphasis. His speech was slushy, slurry, as though his tongue was missing. He was approximating speech, but still difficult to make out. I looked into those green orbs and repeated back what he said. Check tank, please? It nodded its liquid head, its featureless face almost looking relieved. Then it melted into a deluge of stagnant water. It was covered in buckets of disgusting sewage. My husband did not believe me. I was cleaning up sewage when he came home, and he was utterly flabbergasted. I told him about the creature, about its final message, but he refused to believe it. It had been a dream, he said. The septic tank had flowed back into the house, and I had dreamed this watery creature. We went back and forth for hours until I finally had the solution. Open the septic tank. If there's nothing there, I'll say never another word about it. I'll deal with the gurgles and bubbles, and I'll never say another word about it. After another hour of arguing, he finally relented. We called a service, and they breached the lid. It wasn't too hard. The earth was removed, and the lid was removed with a small backhoe. The smell was atrocious, but the men didn't seem to mind. My husband told them we had a problem with the tank. It had flowed into the house, and they figured a valve had become stuck. I saw the pumper hose descend, and the tank was emptied. My husband said I didn't need to be here for this, but I wanted to see. As the sewage went down, I saw the operator's eyes grow large. He called his partner over, and a flashlight was found. The flashlight nearly fell into the tank when it fell across the sewage-covered lump. His partner told us that there appeared to be something in the tank, but we shouldn't worry. The house has been empty for a while, so it's probably just a concealed mass or something. The operator continued to pump the tank, and as the water level fell, we saw the lump was more than congealed waste. It was a body. The police were called. Our front yard was soon playing host to 3 squad cars, a fire truck, and an ambulance. The techs were shunted aside as rescue members retrieved the body from the septic tank and loaded the remains into a body bag for identification. The police asked us some questions, but had already cleared us for the most part, since the body appeared to have been there for months. The inspector who had done the initial inspection had likely not breached the tank all during his initial inspection, so the body could have been there for years if it had not been sealed properly. As the bag was zipped, I got a momentary glance at it. It was large, the head bald and lumpy. It looked a little like the sewage that had towered over me in the hallway. Before they zipped it up, the necessitated creature's mouth lolled open, and I felt a chill run down my spine. His tongue was mangled. Since the incident, we have heard no more burbling. The septic tank hadn't sputtered, and the house has been so quiet that at night, other than the sounds of my family, my husband still can't explain how I knew there was a body in the tank. But I'm just glad that there was ultimately a happy ending to this story. So next time you hear a burbling in your pipes, don't discount it as a simple plumbing issue. Your house may be hearing blurbles from beyond.
My grandmother spoke today. My grandmother has been catatonic for the last 5 years. On the night that Grandpa died, her neighbors called the police to come check on her. They said she was screaming loud enough to be heard 3 houses down, and when the paramedics arrived, she had ruptured something in her throat. Grandpa was dead in the bed they shared, a heart attack. And as they zipped Grandpa into the black bag that would take him to the morgue, they carried Grandma out on a stretcher. After that, she wouldn't speak, wouldn't move. She just lay in bed and stared at the ceiling of her room in Shady Lane nursing home. My grandma, always a strong lady, is fed mechanically. She wears diapers that an orderly has to change. The physical exercise she gets comes in the form of a physical therapist moving her legs for her as she lays in bed. If she leaves the room, it's because Denise or Reggie, the only 2 orderlies who seem to give a crap about the residents, lift her into her wheelchair and take her outside to the resource room, which is really just a fancy word for the TV room. I begin my story this way, so you'll know how weird today's events are. I'm a 35-year-old father of 2. I've been married since I was 27 to the love of my life. I thought that after 8 years of marriage and raising children, nothing could get to me like it did today. I'm sitting at my computer with a bottle of scotch by my elbow and a sinking fear of returning to my marriage bed. It all started when I went to visit my grandma today. My family has a system. Mom and Dad go to visit Grandma on Monday. I go visit on Wednesday. My little sister Lisa goes on Friday. and we all go visit on Sunday after church. My wife doesn't go every time, but she comes with me sometimes. She's known Grandma since we were 17, and she remembers her before her current condition. She wasn't particularly close with Grandma, but I think she likes to be there for me. My grandma and I have always been close. I love my grandma, and I don't want to waste the time I might have left with her. Whether she knows I'm there or not, it's the thought that counts, and I owe her that much. I went on my lunch break today to see her. Reggie was there when I came in, and he gave me a big smile as he finished fussing with her pillows. It always warms my heart to see you and your sister coming to visit your old grandma, he said. He let me know how her vitals were, told me about the doctor's visit she had last week, and then he said he would leave us to our visit. Just me and my grandma. I took out my lunch and made some one-sided small talk as I ate. I had read somewhere that coma patients are aware that someone is talking to them, and in some cases it sometimes helps with them come out of their coma. Grandma wasn't really in a coma. No one really knew what she was going on with her, but I like to think that maybe one day she'd come out of it and thank me for all the lovely visits. She'd say it was my voice that kept her going all these years. I'm pretty sure my sister just played on her phone the whole time she was there, and I'd like to feel that I helped my grandma in some way while she was going through this troubled time. Be careful what you wish for, I guess. I was just telling Grandma about a client I had helped at work when she suddenly inhaled sharply and exhaled in a rattling, skeletal way. I paused, my hand still holding hers as it usually did, and was about to get Reggie. Suddenly the hand tightened spasmodically, and she made another of those rattling breaths, her eyes rolling wildly. She was like a frightened horse looking for an escape, and though it was the middle of the day, I felt a cold chill run through me as she shuddered and gasped in pure terror. "His hands," she breathed out. "The hands of the dead." I pushed back suddenly, letting go of her clenching hand. "Grandma, are you listen to me. I don't have much time, Bug." She was awake. Her face was pale and thin. Her hands little more than fleshy claws. But she was awake. She was looking at me in that way that people look at fire exits in an inferno. And as I tried to get up, she reached out again and took my hand in her cold, damp embrace. I wanted to get Reggie. Reggie would know what to do. But the naked want on her face held me in place. I knew I wasn't going anywhere. She'd called me Bug. That had always been her nickname for me, and when she said it, I realized how much I wanted to hear her say it again. "Please, Bug, I need to tell you what he said. You need to know." She was frantic, almost pleading, and my knees set me down without thinking. And this is what she told me. They had been in bed together when it had happened. Both were at that advanced age where laying together was just that. The two were in bed, sleeping, just being with each other, when Granddad's shuddering had woken her up. His arms had been around her, and her back had been against his front. I knew from familiarity that this is how they always slept since they'd been married at 17. The position was as natural as sleep itself. His shuddering had woken her up. His hands were grasping at me. His fingers were together like a pair of mittens, and he was opening and closing like slow, pained machines. His mouth was against my ear, and his breath was raspy and panting. He sounded like he'd been running, and as he bucked around, I knew he must be having another heart attack. Your granddad's health hadn't been good for a while, but as I tried to break free of his arms, he held me tight and leaned his mouth in close. "No, Ellie, don't go. Please, I'm scared, Ellie. I'm scared," he said, and God helped me. He sounded terrified. "Don't be scared, Roy," I told him. "You'll be okay. I'll call Dr. Steffens and he'll—" "I can't see, Ellie." That's what he said to me. "I can't see, Ellie. They say you see the light or you hear a voice, but I can't see, Ellie. It's all just black. It's all black. And I can't see his face or hear his voice." He gripped me hard, and I felt his nails through my nightshirt as he did it. His heart attack was bad, and I was terrified that he wouldn't come through this time. I tried to break free. I tried to get loose, but his arms were so rigid that I couldn't get away. The whole time he's been panting and telling me how there's nothing there, how it's all just blackness. And he knows there's nothing there. He kept right on repeating it, even as his voice went out, and then he leaned in close until his lips were on my ear, and breathed out one final time. It was the first time I screamed. I screamed because I was in the arms of a dead man. He was gone, Bug. He'd breathed his last, and that was that. But now I was caught in his last embrace. Her voice took on a tenuous, hysterical sound, and I remember thinking that somewhere a machine must be going off. Somewhere telemetry must be telling someone about her heart was racing along too fast. Someone somewhere must be on their way with a crash cart, or a doctor, or a shot to calm her, because in this room she was close to hysterics. I wanted to get her that shot. As many times as I had prayed to God to hear her speak again, I wanted to see that man come through that door with a shot, so she would slip back off again. As much as I wanted her back, I knew that this was not okay. At this moment, I wanted her back in her catatonic state. I wanted this jittery, hysterical creature out of pain. I pulled at his hands, those strong hands that would take mine sometimes, and they were hard as stone. They'd locked in death, and now I could not separate them. His weight was a stone around me. And I was afraid, Bug. I was afraid I'd never get loose, and they'd find us both dead right here. Him of a heart attack, and me of just plain old starvation. Her voice broke, and when she closed her hurting green eyes, I saw the tears spilling out. I had to break his fingers. They sounded like dry twigs when they cracked the fire. After I'd broken 4 of them, I almost had his hands apart. And that's when he came back. She whispered as though he might hear her. Her words made my blood run cold. He'd been dead for 5 minutes, but his chest was close enough that I could feel nothing beating. But all of a sudden, his arms tightened around me and screamed into my ear like a wolf in a trap. He pulled hard against him. I felt my ribs trying to break, and all of a sudden he was bucking and thrashing like the devil himself had a hold of him. It burns, Ellie! He just kept screaming it into my ear, and when I finally thrust his hands apart, I rolled out of bed and got as far from it as I could. That's where they found me, Bug. They found me in the corner. They found me screaming. I don't know what was burning him, but I saw his last few minutes before he went out again. He writhed, he screamed, and he died in agony. What kind of place had he'd been in that would make him scream like that. I thought, what kind of place? What kind of place? What kind of place? She just kept on mumbling that phrase again and again until I couldn't take it anymore. I got up and walked out as fast as I could, and I never looked back. I don't know what I'll do next time I have to come see her. I didn't go back to work. I called my boss and told him I wasn't feeling well and that I needed to go home. He let me. He's a good man, and when I called Reggie later that afternoon, he told me she was right as rain as usual. When he'd given her meds that afternoon, she was still lying in bed and staring at the ceiling as always. He never hinted at any changes in telemetry, never said a word about abnormal vitals, just told me how much he knew it meant to her that I came and visited. Now I'm just staring at my computer, and I don't know what to do. I've been sitting here for about an hour and contemplating how I'll get on with the rest of my life, knowing my grandfather's agony and my grandmother's terror at the end of his life. I've been contemplating how I'll climb into that bed with my own wife tonight, a problem that seems to be more here and now. You see, the thought of her wrapping her arms around me, placing her chest against my back, makes me want to shudder right out of my skin. What would I do if she woke me up in the throes of a heart attack? What would I do if she whispered those same hopeless words into my ear before she died? What would I do if I found myself trapped in the embrace of my own dying love? I don't know.
Never take a sleeping pill called Somnidrill. You might never wake up again. Written by PriestessOfSpiders on Reddit. I have always had horrible insomnia. Ever since I was a very young child, I would find myself tossing and turning at night, unable to fall asleep. It was a rare day when I woke up feeling even mostly well rested. I started taking melatonin and some other meds that could help me sleep at a fairly young age. They helped a bit, but people still commented on the near constant bags under my eyes. A little over a week ago, I stopped by the local grocery store after work, looking to get a fresh supply of sleeping pills to replace the ones I ran out of the night before. I went to the usual spot and just grabbed a bottle blindly. Not even looking at it. The cashier did not seem to look either, just scanned it and tossed it into a little plastic bag, which I would add to the already substantial pile which overflowed out of my trash can. It wasn't until late at night I actually took a look at the bottle, and I was angry. Sure, from a distance, it looked like the usual brand I got, but up close it was markedly different. It looked like some cheap knockoff, deliberately designed to look similar to the name brand in order to trick the unwary buyer into buying it. The label on the bottle said Somnidrill in crisp blue lettering, with no slogan, no chemical name, or anything else useful. I couldn't even find a company logo. I checked for the drug facts, hoping that at least it would have the same active ingredients as what I usually used. But no luck. All I could find on the back was a single sentence. Take 1 pill before bed. There was no way to tell what this drug was, and I groaned in frustration and fatigue. I figured I would try to get some rest without medicine tonight. I didn't want to risk it. I turned on my white noise machine, put on my eye mask, and tried to rest. As the minutes turned to hours, the bottle of Somnidrill on the bedside started to feel more and more appealing. Finally, at nearly 3 a.m., I gave in and opened the bottle. The pills inside were gel capsules, filled with an opaque purple liquid. Without a second thought, I dry swallowed one and went back to bed. I started to try to count sheep in my head to tire myself. I got to 23 sheep before I lost consciousness. I suddenly found myself on hard concrete. I rubbed my eyes, standing up as best I could. When I opened them, I found I wasn't in my room. I stood on the edge of a tall building, looking over an enormous, brutalist city extending as far as I could see. Endless chaotic masses of angular gray buildings, surrounded by thick mist. I couldn't see the ground or the sky. Eventually, everything was so foggy, it was as if there was nothing there but buildings forever. Enormous spires of dark concrete extended for what seemed like miles into the sky, larger than any metropolitan building in the real world. There were no windows on any of the titanic structures, no lights to show I wasn't alone. The smell of the mold was heavy in the air, and I began to feel woozy. My eyelids fluttered as I started to lean towards the edge, about to fall. I woke up in bed, the faint sunlight pouring through my apartment window. It was about a minute before the alarm was due to go off. Normally when I dream about falling, I wake up in a cold sweat, panicked, heart racing. This was different. I felt so energized, so utterly awake and ready to seize the day. Whatever this somni drill was, it was certainly working to fix my insomnia. The other employees at my cruddy minimum wage job were surprised to see how energized I was, and even my manager complimented me on my work. The endless parade of annoying customers seemed a little bit more bearable, less grating. I felt truly rested for the first time of my life. When it came to go to bed, I happily took another pill, genuinely looking forward to waking up well rested and focused. I counted how long it would take for me to lose consciousness. I got to exactly 23 seconds before I once again found myself in that strange gray city. This time I was on a terrace, once again overlooking the impossible, endless metropolis. I turned away from the sight, not wanting to fall like the last time. There was a doorway leading into the building, dimly illuminated despite there being no light source. I stepped inside, the slap of my bare feet echoing through the gloom and fog. The stench of decay and dampness increased as I walked through a maze of winding gray corridors, taking turns at random. Clusters of black mold dotted the walls with tendrils of the fungus extending off them like veins. As I approached another turn, I noticed the small pulsating black mass on the corner of the wall and ceiling. I touched it gingerly, and it erupted into a swarm of 8-legged bodies, scattering as the arachnids skittered away from the offending digit. Startled, I pulled away my hand and backed away with a gasp. Just daddy long legs, I thought to myself, gingerly avoiding stepping on the dozens of harvestmen which were scampering across the floor. I continued onward. It felt like I had been walking forever, and I had no idea how long I had been there. I remembered stories of people who had dreams from which they felt like lasted years, how they awoke missing spouses they never married, children who were never born. And I started to become afraid that I would never leave. As I started to panic, I started to hear something which pierced the unending silence of the dead city. A faint hum of static, like a whole white noise machine set to low volume. It reminded me of the gentle roar of ocean waves upon a distant shore. I began to move towards the noise, wanting to be free of the monotony of pointless exploration. I quickened my pace, jogging down the black corridor towards the static. As I rounded the corner at the end of the hallway, I caught a glimpse of something else, something pale, moving around the corner. As it moved away from me, the static grew quieter. I started to take a step towards where the thing had left when I woke up. Once again, I felt rested and energized, but the dream lingered in my mind. It was much longer this time, and felt more vivid. Explaining away the dream lasted longer simply because I slept more than the night before. It was the weekend, so I decided to spend the day cleaning up my apartment and doing some long overdue chores. The energy I got from the sleep was stronger, more pure than anything caffeine could produce. I didn't need to touch an energy drink or a cup of coffee for the whole day. By the time I was done, the apartment looked cleaner than it had in years. I ordered something for takeout for the night, a reward for a good day's work, before spending some time reading, something I usually didn't have the mental clarity to do. By the time I felt tired enough to head off to bed, it was nearly 12 a.m. I went into the bedroom and changed into my pajamas for bed. I looked over at the Somnidrill on my nightstand. I knew I wouldn't be able to get to sleep without it, but I still felt trepidation. I remembered the previous dream quite strongly, more than I had any dream before. It felt so real, all 5 senses engaged. It had frightened me, but at the same time, it felt better than I ever had. I felt like the constant drowsiness which hung over my life like a fog was finally lifted, that I was free. Before I could change my mind, I popped one of the gel capsules in my mouth and swallowed, laying in bed and counting the seconds as I waited for sleep. Once again, exactly 23 seconds passed before I fell asleep. I was in a long, bare hallway, dimly illuminated despite there being no source of light. It seemed to continue onward in front of me into infinity. The same black mold grew in odd clumps on the walls, and I could see a twitching mass of daddy longlegs near the ceiling. I turned around and saw the hallway continue on and on and on ad infinitum behind me as well. It seemed like the whole world had been replaced with these miles of concrete. In no particular hurry, I turned back around and started walking. I reflected on how quickly the transition from the waking world to the dream had been. It felt less as if I drifted off to sleep, and more as if I'd suddenly been instantaneously transported into another place. It didn't feel like I was asleep. That sense of being guided along by the whims of my unconscious mind wasn't there. I was wholly lucid and entirely aware of my surroundings. I could feel the cold, slightly damp concrete beneath my bare feet. I could smell the scent of rot and stale air. I could hear the titanus ringing in my ears due to the utter and complete silence, broken only by the stepping of feet as I marched endlessly onward. I tried to keep track of how long I had been there, but it is hard to tell time without a watch nor visible sky. It could have been hours, or merely 20 minutes. There was no way for me to tell. I didn't feel any hunger or thirst, so it could not have been too long.
I started to hear the faintest hum of static coming from behind me. I turned around and squinted. Peering into the distance, straining my eyes to catch even a glimpse of the source of the noise. At first I didn't see anything at all, just an expansive hallway, stretching on forever. But then I noticed a very slight hint of movement in the distance. Something large and indistinct. So far away it was barely visible, but rapidly getting closer. I turned around and started running at full speed. I was glad I had saved my energy before, because now I needed to move as quickly as possible. I pushed myself as hard as I could, lungs burning from the effort, as I filled them with musty, stale air. I could hear the roaring static increase in volume behind me, but there seemed to be no end to this blank, featureless corridor. My muscles began to ache with the strain, my body begging me to just stop, lie down, and accept my fate. I was running on pure adrenaline, pushed on by the primal need to live, to survive. The once faint static was now almost unbearable in the intensity. It sounded like I was being pursued by a boombox, blasting the sound of TV static at full volume. My ears felt as though they were going to burst from the intense noise. I shook my head and closed my eyes, trying to block out the dreadful cacophony. I then tripped. I sprawled out across the hard concrete, getting the briefest glimpse of my pursuer. An amorphous mass of gray cloth and outstretched, pale arms, covered with black veins of mold. Hundreds of harvestmen skittered on spindly legs through the holes of its voluminous robes, and it glided towards me at a speed like a freight train. The unbearable roar of static ceased, as I felt warm liquid dribble out my ears. A pale, long-nailed hand grasped my leg, and I screamed as I felt its touch burn my flesh. And then I was awake. Blood stained my pillow, dripping from my deafened ears. I fell out of bed screaming, but I couldn't hear my own cries. I attempted to stand up, but stumbled, my leg burning with intense pain. Gingerly, I rolled up my pant leg, revealing a white mark in the shape of a handprint. According to the doctors, both my eardrums had been severely ruptured. I should be able to recover in a few weeks if I make sure they don't get infected. They didn't even try to come up with a good explanation. According to them, I must have sleepwalked and jammed pencils in my ears. They couldn't explain the handprint either. It looked like frostbite, but there was no way I could have gotten it under the blanket of my heated room. They insisted that the handprint shape of the mark must be a simple coincidence. I managed to get a week off from work to recover, but I had to use up all of my sick days and remaining vacation hours to do it. It's been 5 days since the incident, and I haven't been able to sleep. I've tried everything, but no matter what, I just can't make myself lose consciousness. Without sleep, the brain starts to fail. Nobody knows exactly what will happen when it will outright kill you, but I must be getting close. I've begun hallucinating now, seeing little veins of black mold on my walls, daddy longlegs climbing on the ceiling, and every so often I hear the faintest hint of static. I need to sleep, but I know now that the only way I'm going to get any rest is to go back to that horrible place. I have a glass of water and a pill of Somnidril on my nightstand. Pray for me. The story is called A Voice in the Vent. Now, go grab some water, get settled down, and without further ado, let's get started, shall we?
I remember when playing in the woods behind my house was an endless exploration of imaginative adventure that could only further inspire my 8-year-old mind. Many times I was a barbarian warrior like Conan, lopping off heads with my enchanted tree branch. The evil beasts conjured up in my mind stood no chance against my strength and wit. My lust for action and romantic adventure, however. I now realize just how close my world was intertwined with the Cimmerian of his fiction. For many times the tales of sword and sorcery described monsters of unfathomable terror. Of such, only the brute force and unwavering mind of a fearless warrior could encounter and hope to defeat it. I was not this warrior, and yet my discovery of a hidden terror seemed to be destined for me to find. For when I wandered off the set path which leads from mine to my grandparents' houses, I stumbled across a shaded path of forest, with a small, murky pond at its center. The area was dead quiet, save for the crunching of the dead leaves beneath my feet, and the occasional nerve-wracking pop of breaking twigs. I remember a slight fog over the water, more like vapors dissipating, as if the pond were boiling. Yet, being such an ignorant youth, I reached down and touched the surface, and it felt very, very cold. So much so that I drew back my hand in surprise, only to begin violently wiping my fingers on my clothes, for the liquid was some sort of sticky alcohol. With the commotion I made, I heard across the water a soft rustling that seemed to be heading around the pond in my direction, but I stopped once and glanced towards it. For all my fear of the sound, my eyes suddenly came across a shape in the center of the pond. It was a pale like smooth limestone, yet it came from a small delicate trail of bubbles escaping from an unseen pocket of air. Stupidly, I started to lean forward, squinting for a better look. I fell. My body was submerged in the cold burning of the foggy liquid. I desperately tried to place my feet on whatever ground I could find, but there was none. I kicked and thrashed towards the surface, not wanting to open my eyes for fear of the liquid blinding me. Suddenly, I felt one of my feet strike something hard. That limestone, maybe. But in response, there came a sound, a low grunt of some kind. The pond began to build up a slight current and, as if returning the favor, a sharp pain hit my thigh. I screamed into the mysterious waters and put all my efforts into reaching the shore of what now seemed like an infinite ocean. I was no longer Conan as I breached the surface. I was a child, crying out for his parents, smothering from the fumes of potentially poisonous body of creature-infested water. I climbed out after what seemed like an eternity of an unwaking nightmare, and refused to look back as I ran from the pond. I expected to hear the sound of the monster breaching the pond, but the silence of the dark woods remained unbroken. The vapors were drying liquid, trailed behind me, as I desperately made for the familiar path. When it was in sight, I felt the calmness of familiarity, which caused me to slow my pace. The world was luminous with the summer evening, and the creatures of common knowledge went about their business,
ignorant of what I had found. When I reached home, I wondered if I had only dreamed up another fantasy in which I encountered in the pond. There was no scent of the strange water, no more burning in my skin, but the fear in my heart resounded as I looked down at my torn jeans and spied the coagulated blood from a long scratch in my flesh. I hurried inside, tossed my clothes in the hamper, and showered for good measure, unintentionally earning praise from my mother for being on top of my hygienics. I told my parents nothing about the pond or the scratch, but I couldn't completely hide my fearful glances to the window facing the edge of the forest during the winter. The questions, however, did not come. All was normal within our home, which made more and more at ease, as well as conscious of my illogical perception. The evening went on with my dad, and watching the reruns of Star Trek while my mom read one of her awful Amish-based novels in the lamplights. I think of this time to comfort myself with what followed. I was tucked into bed lovingly by my parents. Being an only child at the time, I was coddled quite a bit. My bedroom was alight with glow-in-the-dark stars, posters of Star Wars, shelves of action figures ready to defend me while I slumbered. The light of my aquarium and the shadows of angelfish gliding on the walls eased me into a near doze until the bubbles from the pump caused me to open my eyes in fear. Suddenly, as if responding to my fearful pondering, I hear a scratch in the vent near the right of my bed. A soft clinking followed my breathing, as if something small was making a great effort to get through the grate. I was terrified. My hopes that my imagination from my playful excursion of the day had overtaken my senses. My hopes were dashed. The spark logic prior had provided the explanations for all that overcame me was lost. Yet the delusion refused to let loose its prisoner, which was my sanity. I knew I had to face it in order to prove its non-existence so that logic may once again have its dominion. Hello? I asked the darkness. Immediately the noises ceased, and in my mind's eye I could see a rat scurrying away in fear of its discovery. But it was my contribution to this fable which was now dismissed. "You found it, boy," came the whisper of a tiny creature behind the grate. My eyes swelled with tears at the sound. I was about to call out for my parents when it continued. "All this time I tried to keep it hidden from you. Short noses and a runt such as yourself seems compelled to find and wake it." The voice was quite irritated, yet it also contained fear in its reverberations. "What was it?" I asked in a trembling voice. My aquarium bubbled quietly, reminding me of the pale shape in the pond. "It is a manticore, one that has hibernated for many human lifetimes, but that has ended far more. I was entrusted to watch over it by the one who placed it in its prison, and you stirred it, and now it will soon awaken." I raised up, forgetting my fear of the disturbing circumstance of speaking with this hidden thing. I knew what a manticore was. I knew it well enough to have it far from my mind to dream up during my woodland adventures, for the image of the creature caused real fear in me. Though, in a hypothetical sense, the images I had seen in books of the monster went through my brain and disturbed me anew.
Now I realized that I had been scratched by the thing in its restlessness. Had I opened my eyes while submerged in the pond, I knew that I would have gone mad to see its shape within the burning fog. "What can I do?" I asked the voice. It did not respond, yet I could hear it breathing in the vents. "Please," I whimpered. I didn't mean to wake it up. I was trembling beneath my bed sheets, which used to make me feel safe. Now I only felt cold and alone and guilty for bringing such a thing back into this world. "You cannot put it back to sleep. It has been too long, and now it will be hungry. You cannot hurt it with any weapon, for its flesh is invulnerable. It can eat you up whole, and it will leave no bones behind. Its roar is terrible, boy. Your mother and father will wake to the sound of it, and will be taken by madness once it enters your home. It will devour your neighbors, all who dwell nearby, and no one will know what has happened to you." I fell out of my bed and onto the floor sobbing. I crawled to the vent and put my face to it without fear of what I might see, if anything. "What can I do?" I implored in quiet desperation. "How can I kill it?" In the grate, I could see a tiny shape stirring within. 2 glimmers of silvery light peered at me, and I could see the green flesh of a long pointed nose. It was a goblin, small and mischievous looking, though at the moment the eyes looked sad and pitying. When it spoke to you for the final time, I sensed the want of a brighter circumstance. "If you wish truly to be the hero you pretend to be, you must slay it through its mouth." The eyes disappear, and a soft scrambling shape faded into the darkness. I was alone with this frightening knowledge, and I had to make a choice. Should I return to my bed and risk waking the roar of the manticore, or do I face the night and the strange water to slay it before it rises? I was a child. I was scared, but I knew I couldn't let my family and my neighbors be devoured because of what I had done. I dressed, grabbed a flashlight, and a small family picture propped on the table next to my bed, then quietly went to the kitchen and grabbed the largest knife from the rack. With the weapon in hand, I went out to the back of the swaying of trees of a windy midnight. I started the path with an empty mind, neither allowing terrible imaginations nor doubting logic hinder my stride. I wasn't brave, I wasn't foolish, I simply was. The reality, or at least my perception of it, had been shattered into shapeless pieces of mirror that, no matter how well formed, could never show my reflection in its former naivete. I prayed that I wouldn't find the pond, but I knew for sure that I would. The shape would be there. I would have to go back into the water and somehow open the mouth of the manticore and shove in a feeble kitchen knife. This was my plight. I was 8 years old, on an adventure, and my favorite place to pretend, and all I could feel, a laughing mockery at my innocence when I left the path once more. There was no sound but the wind in the trees. A crescent moon and star-filled sky watched me from afar. I held my family picture to my chest and walked the hills of dead leaves. The beam of my flashlight shone through the trees, who almost seemed lonely in this part of the woods. For in truth, this was a world left behind a long, long time ago, when fairies took flight in elvish gardens, and satyrs piping tunes for dancing nymphs. Whatever creatures flourished in this pocket of time, so close to my home,
were long since devoured by the manticore. Likely whatever force imprisoned the beast also sent it here to our plane, as well as having the courtesy of leaving a goblin behind to watch over it. No doubt this is the same being still showing travesties in other worlds as it has for us in present. I finally saw the pond reflecting its murky grayness with my flashlight, and my soul cried out within me as a cold fear enveloped my body. There were no more vapors floating above the surface, neither was the pale shape below. It was still, and it was empty. The thoughts now began to race, both logical and fantastical. It was gone. It was never there. I can return to my warm bed and forget all about it. It will be fine. It will be there waiting for me in the midst of my parents' innards. I wanted to scream for all the emotions, but it was the manticore that screamed into the night, sending a terrible jolt throughout my body. My bowels cramped at the sight of the giant face of a man hovering 10 feet in the air. The paws of the enormous lion body thudded at the ground. The wings on its back flapped, a gust that almost made me topple over. The bobbed porcupine-like tail flicked violently to the right, taking out a tree with one careless swipe. The eyes were large and bulging yellow with black gashes for feline pupils. When my eyes met that of the monster, it screamed again in satisfaction at its discovery of its first meal in a long, long time. I could see its 3 rows of teeth as it howled at me, and yet somehow my only thought was, my parents are hearing this, and they're going to find that I'm out of bed. They're going to look for me, and they won't find me. I'll have been swallowed whole. When the manticore reached me, it stooped and gazed at my tiny form. It did something that finally snapped me out of my insane stupor. It grinned. The monster was grinning at my fear. The teeth were sharp and yellow. The stench of its breath broke through each of them and made me almost vomit. Stagnation of time. The willingness of its stomach acids to return to its labor. The manticore was ready to indulge itself. It breathed in through its nostrils, then opened its mouth and slowly came down over my head. Yet somehow, instead of succumbing to terror, a white-hot hatred took over me suddenly. I was offended at how weak it perceived me. I was irate at how much of a bully this thing was. This freak of nature had thrown its weight around eons ago and eradicated the peaceful world which it blighted. I refused to let that happen again. To my family, my neighbors, to me, I stepped on the first layer of teeth as I stabbed the knife into its tongue. It screamed and began to try to close its jaws on me, but I had already climbed in further and now sank my knife into the roof of its mouth. The beast thrashed its head, trying to sling me out, but I kept climbing further in, slicing and stabbing all the way through. I remember that barbarous man of action I pretended to be, and I embraced it fully, burrowing deep into its throat, splitting the blood from its own mouth as I climbed. By the sudden change in equilibrium, I could tell it had fallen to the ground and was struggling against the pain. I pressed my feet against the back of the throat and shoved my knife beneath the skull. I couldn't penetrate it, so I began to cut upward as hard as I could. Its screams were deafening, but I knew that it could hear my laughter. As I sliced and mangled without mercy, suddenly I was drowned in the cold, burning water from the pond. along with my fresh screams. As it mingled with the manticore's wounds, I lost my knife in the flood, but not my footing or the family picture I had in my hand. I kissed it, then smashed the glass in the frame, and then shoved it in the open gash as hard as I could. The monster bellowed, and then suddenly began to whine pitifully. The thrashing ceased, and the water flowed inside, until I was completely submerged. I began to swim out of the mouth, fearing the teeth, but too desperate to hesitate. My eyes burned horribly, and all vision had darkened from the night, so I felt my way past the teeth, and to the surface. Through the burning, I could make out my flashlight, which lay on the ground, and I swam towards it, fearing the claws of the beast seizing me before that and pulling me under. Suddenly, there were small hands, grabbing my right arm and helping me out of the pond. It was the goblin, though I could barely see its shape.
"You did it, boy! You did it! You have slain the manticore!"
I was confused. All the effort I had put forth to hurt this creature didn't seem enough to kill it. The goblin continued to bellow his claim, and I expected any moment the thing to rise back up once more and chomp us both. Yet, the creature was silent. I could see now that it had plunged headfirst into the pond and drowned itself. Apparently, it's really dead? I asked.
"Poisoned. The water is deadly to manticores that ingest it, which is why it was put to sleep here, but they can only hold their breath for such a long time. You made it drink the water to relieve the torture you brought upon it. Its innards will now burn away." I fell back and watched the star-filled sky. A meteor passed, and with it went my wish to always have this bravery that overcame my impossible fear. As the years progressed in my life, and I found myself abandoning my imaginations, my thoughts of heroism, I still remember the moment when I accepted a new reality at the edge of the pond.
Called Black Site 7, written by Eurytris on Reddit. Check them out. Link to the original story will be in the description below. Now, without further ado, let's get started. I'm in the wind. I'm sure I'll be dead by tomorrow, but I need to let people know this thing is loose. I'm an agent with the United States government, and my station is Black Site 7. I won't tell you my name. It would probably be useless to you. But this was not how I saw my life going. I spent 6 years in Iraq, signed up right after high school. It was nothing like the recruiter told me it would be. I spent 8 years in the blistering heat. I hauled my fair share of comrades out of firefights, and saw a lot of shit over there that would make ordinary people go crazier than I might be. I've had camel spiders crawl on me while I sleep. I watched my friends I've known since basic get decapitated through binoculars, burned houses full of insurgents, and civilians to rubble, and a lot of other things I don't like to think about. When I was done, they gave me my papers, thanked me for my service, and sent me home. I know I have no right to complain. Many guys didn't make it back, but home has been worse. I spent the last 6 years in an active combat zone, and now I was supposed to come home and go back to civilian life? I spent 3 months in the civilian world. 2 of those months were spent in a cruddy apartment because my parents couldn't handle the night terrors and the jumpy marine that had come back. Before I knew it, it wasn't going to work. Every car honk, every barking dog, every firework rattling in the street had me reaching for my gun and breaking into a cold sweat when I couldn't find it. Before TJ found me, I was considering unaliving myself. Then one day, he was
just at my door with that big shit-eating grin he'd always worn in the desert. "You look like shit, House. Let's get you some pancakes. I've got something I want to discuss with you." TJ was my platoon leader in the sandbox. They called him the comedian because he was always smiling, always cracking jokes. He was a functional sociopath. Well, I guess most of us were. I always admired his ability to laugh in the face of such screwed up stuff. TJ was not his real name, but since he's still in this stuff that I've left behind, I figure the best I can do is not remind him he's why I'm here. He took me to breakfast, and in the back of a crowded Denny's, and he laid it all out for me. "You've got a bad house," he said through a mouthful of pancakes. "But that's okay, 'cause old Uncle TJ has the cure for you. I've got a new job. Familiar work that might interest you. Ever hear of Two Trees?" I had. Two Trees was a government institute that, on the surface, did a lot of medical research and clinics trials. Underneath, though, they did wet work, and anyone who was involved in covert ops knew about Two Trees. We'd worked with them a few times in Iraq, and their guys were spooky, to say the least. "You're looking at the new head of Black Site 7. I furrowed my brow at him. "Congratulations. Should I know what that is?" "Of course not. It's a closely guarded government secret. Two Trees is paying me a small fortune to keep it that way, too. The problem is, I need someone to curate the site for me. Someone with military training, experience with firearms, and a need for some normalcy." "Know anyone like that?" I knew what he was asking, but I didn't think I was who he was looking for. I hadn't found work in the 3 months I'd been back, and most of that was because I couldn't settle into anything. I was constantly jumpy, constantly on edge, and that makes it hard to find work. No one wanted you doing security work or minding a gas station when every backfiring car was an enemy combatant. What would happen if I had an episode in the government facility? I shook my head. "Thanks, but no thanks. I don't think I'm fit for duty the way I am." "Yeah, I thought you might say that," he said, putting a metal tin in front of me. "Your medical files read like a benchmark for PTSD. Night terrors, irritability, being on edge, those irrational bouts of anger that got you thrown out of your parents' house," he added with a little smirk. I felt defensive. "How do you know about that?" "You'd be surprised what my level of clearance will get you. Your therapist records were about as hard to get as a beer at a gas station." "Well, I've got a little present for you, House. Welcome to the rest of your life," he said, indicating the silver case. The case was about as big as an Altoids tin. There were no markings, no filigree or needless ornament, and it had a distinctly surgical look. I slid my hand towards it, but it didn't seem to want to touch it. Every sense I had told me to walk away now, not to touch it, and just walk away from this unassuming little case. I forced my hand to pop it open instead. Inside was a pair of pale gray gel caps. "What are these?" "These are the answers to your prayers. 2 of these a day and you'll feel as calm and clear as you ever did when you were a mere old lad of 18. No more jumping at every noise. No more reaching for your gun when a dog barks or a car backfires. Just peace of mind." I imagine now that this is what Mephistopheles sounded like when he spoke to Faust. "What's the catch?" "These pills are only available through the Two Trees Corporation. Employees who agree to be part of the clinical trial get them free of charge. But they're only available to employees," he said with a little grin. "Take them, take a day to feel the effects, and let me know what you think. Call me tomorrow and give me your answer then. Enjoy a night of freedom, and then make your decision. I took the pills home with me, and after a few hours of staring at them, I took them with some vodka. The effects were instantaneous. If you've never had PTSD, then it's hard to explain, but it's like having a loose wire that someone fixes. And then when you go back to the way you were, my anxiety melted away, my fear dissipated, my unease and dread were gone, and my anger, well, it seemed like a distant memory. I was sitting in my cruddy apartment, surrounded by the trappings of my depression and my anxiety, and suddenly I felt like I'd boarded a bus in 2003 and headed out to basic training. I was finally comfortable in my own head, and it was like coming back to a safe place after years of running from danger. After the first good night's sleep I've had since shipping out, and I called TJ and told him I was in. "One question," I asked. "What's in the pills that makes them work so well?" He was silent for a long time before saying, "You really don't want to know, House. Bag your shit, there'll be a truck to move you to West Virginia in the morning." And that's how I came to work at Black Site 7. I must have looked like a junkie by the time I pulled up in front of my new home. I didn't have much. The truck had taken all of 4 boxes into the deep woods as I followed in my old compact. The journey took about 16 hours, and by the time I got there, I was starting to feel the anxiety creep back in. I became angry about how slow the truck is moving, afraid that this whole thing was a trick so they could kill me. By the time I arrived, I found myself wanting to die, hoping for death so I could return to the quiet that had been in my head before. That was when I saw TJ standing at the gates of what looked like an old military checkpoint. He flashed that oh-so-knowing smile and handed me another silver case. I dry swallowed the pills without a word and felt the inner peace warming back across my brain. And then he showed me my new quarters. It was a little bunk room with a bed, a kitchenette, and lockers for clothes. There was a footlocker for my personal stuff, and I was told to keep the space clean. I would be responsible for the site and its security. TJ showed me a terminal off the bedroom with monitors and camera feeds. The compound had cameras all over the place, but I appeared to be the only one here full time. The site's mostly for storage these days, but it's what we get up to here at night that may interest you. That's why you're here. I need someone I can trust to watch this site 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 4 times a year. You'll be relieved for a week of R&R somewhere, but other than that, this is your world. That did not bother me. I had no problem being alone after 3 months of people. What I was curious about was what I was doing out here. What am I looking for exactly? TJ pointed at 3 buildings on the camera. A truck comes in twice a week. Let them through the gate and don't bother them. They'll take what they need from the building and they won't bother you. Keep nosy people out of here. Lethal force is authorized. And don't ever go in there, or I'll have to show you where Black Site 8 is, he said with a smile. The smile didn't cross his eyes. Don't worry about being vigilant, though. If anything's bigger than a mouse, and it moves out there, the alarms will let you know about it. He told me that my food would be delivered once a week, mostly MREs, and I could order anything I wanted from the terminal in my living quarters. There was a workout yard near the second building, and I could move through the woods if I chose, as long as I took my phone with me to get alerts from the console. By the way, hand me your phone, he said, and when I did, he put it in his pocket and handed me another one. That's your new phone. I'll take the keys to your car too and put the money from it in your account. This is your life now, House.
so don't take this job lightly. If you leave the grounds, we'll know. If you try to update social media or try to tell anyone on the outside about what you've seen here, we'll know. If you want to marry or feel like you need out, arrangements can be made from your first 5-year tour. As far as anyone's concerned, you no longer exist. Don't be stupid, put in your 5 years and we'll reassess your position. He grinned again and punched me in the arm. And lighten up, this will be the easiest 5 years of your life. And from that point on, I was an employee of 2 Trees. TJ had been right though, the first 5 years flew by. I lived on the site, spending my days working out or watching TV. I played the latest video games and watched the newest movies. Twice a week, as advertised, a truck rolled up and honked. I would check the cameras, open the gates, and they would do the rest. They would honk when they were ready to leave, and I left them alone. The trucks always had the 2 Trees logo on them, and I never heard poop about them. I never tried to get into the warehouses. I had been a soldier long enough to know how to check my curiosity, and the scares were minimal. The food kept coming, the pills that kept me in my right kept coming, and it was pretty peaceful all told. The alarms, to my knowledge, only went off 3 times in that first year, and 2 of those times it was a deer who wandered too close. The first time it happened, I had slunk out in a panic, service pistol in hand and boxer shorts flapping. As I rounded the first warehouse, I drew down on a very surprised doe who darted away before I could draw a bead on her. It was kind of a special moment for me. I had never seen a deer up close, and as it ran away, I was kind of glad I didn't shoot it. The third time the alarms went off, it had been a person. It was the first person I had seen in 3 months. I had been sitting at the console one night, watching the latest Marvel's Avenger movie. I think it was Infinity Wars, when the alarm went off. I paused the movie, expecting to see a deer or rabbit on the monitor. My eyes went wide when I realized it was a person. He had a crowbar, and was attempting to pry the doors open. He must have come out of the woods, because if he had driven up, I'd known about him much sooner. It had been 3 months since I'd seen a person. The last one had been Agent Daughtry, who had come to relieve me for a week of R&R in September. The idea of seeing a person not connected with 2 Trees made me feel kind of weird. Even when you were on R&R, you went to a company resort or a company place full of company people. This stopped you from getting a little too drunk and talking about all the stuff you did for your country. It was a great idea, but it meant you had nearly no interaction with civilians. I took my pistol outside and crept up on him in near silence. When my foot came down on an extra crunchy stick, he turned his head and noticed me. He raised the crowbar as if to attack, and well, the rest was instinct. The gun went off without me even having spoken to him, reflex taking over and dropping the threat before it could become a real danger. His left eye popped like an overripe fruit, and he fell down on the hard December ground. I called TJ, and he and some other men in suits came to assess the damage. "You did just right, House. He was a threat to the facility and needed to be put down. Don't think for a minute that this reflects poorly on you." "What will you do with him?" I asked. TJ smiled. "Immediate disposal, House. Think you've got the stomach to help us?" I found that I did, and once he was doused in gasoline, we set him ablaze on the edge of the property. They gave me an extra week of R&R, and when I came back, TJ must have decided that I was worthy of being bought in on extra certain things. The alarms went off a week after I came back. I saw a black car rolling up through the front gate. TJ stepped out and waved at me. As it stopped on the concrete roundabout, other men getting out as well. I slid my shoulder holster on and went out to meet him. It was 11 p.m., and visits this late were highly irregular.
As I approached the vehicle, 2 other men in suits were bringing a man with a bag on his head out of the car. He was wearing scrubs. The men bound his hands behind his back, and I could hear him crying beneath the black hood he wore. I looked between them, waiting for an expansion, and TJ threw an arm around me and walked me towards the spot where we burnt the trespasser. House, I think it's time that we bring you in on the second reason for the black site. You see, sometimes Two Trees has assets that need to be eliminated. The black sites are often used for these purposes. It's always the responsibility of the site's caretaker to carry out these eliminations. Fringe benefits, I suppose you could say. Why wasn't I told about this before? I asked, feeling indignant. I'm no murderer. Oh, well, those combatants in Iraq will be glad to hear that, won't they? He said, almost snidely. That was war, TJ. This is murder. Think of this as war too, House. These people are the enemy, and they need to be eliminated for the good of the public safety. It's part of the job, House, and a part I know firsthand that you're capable of. They put the man on his knees in the middle of the burnt spot. He was praying under the hood as we stood around him. Put him down, House. That's an order, TJ said. I looked at him icily. And if I won't? The 2 men with him drew their guns, and TJ grinned. Well, then I'm afraid these men will have to execute both of you. Come on, House, don't throw this away over some nobody. He's no different than the man outside this warehouse. I wish now that I'd just let them shoot me, but I guess if I had, you would never know about any of this. Instead, I drew out my gun and put a bullet in his skull, glowering over at TJ as his buddies put their gun away. You made the right choice, House. Who knows, you might not have to do this more than a dozen more times in the next 4 years. I executed an asset a month after that. There were mostly people in scrubs, people in lab coats, doctors, researchers, people who had likely tried to steal from whatever facility they worked at. There were men and women, old men and scared 20-somethings. I never bothered to learn their names. They were just assets to be eliminated. I became kind of numb to the process. We burned them afterwards. Gasoline and fire made it look like they were never there, and the spot near the edge had a charred look to it after a while. At the end of 5 years, TJ came to see me and asked if I wanted to re-up. What happens if I walk away? I asked. I was eating dinner when he'd come by, and he sat down to have a plate of fettuccine with me. Given my free time, I had learned to do a good number of things I couldn't before. I became a pretty good cook, learned to play the guitar, read every book on the shelf I had bought to hold them, and there was a chainsaw out back along with some sculptures I had made with it. I couldn't say I hadn't enjoyed my time here, the killings aside, but I was curious to know if they'd actually let me leave. You'll be allowed to return to the real world, your bank account fuller and your retirement substantial. Just watch what you say out there. I'd have to bring you back in for your replacement to put a bullet in. I ended up signing up for another 5 years. I shouldn't have done that. I was 8 years deep when they bought the girl in the black bag to me. It was 2 a.m. and I started to think about bed when the alarm went off. I saw the town car rolling up, and I looked for TJ. He was not the one who climbed out, however. This guy had his hair slicked back, and his suit was a perfect blue pinstripe. He did not wave at me, and I felt a sense of dread as I grabbed my gun. Somehow, I expected TJ to be under the bag this time. The man's name was Stein, and he didn't have TJ under the bag. What he did have was a kid with a thick, black hood over their head. I couldn't tell at first if it was a boy or a girl. They were dressed in baggy clothes, Salvation Army rags that a homeless person would be embarrassed to wear. and they were crying loudly under their hood. Two familiar men had the kid, and they looked stoic about the whole matter. Stein didn't say anything, just led the precision over to the charred spot and put the kid on their knees. When he made me to remove the hood, I did it myself. He winced, but didn't stop me. This was my place, my job, and I had garnered a reputation for being a professional. A reputation I was about to ruin. The bag came off, and the little girl's tear-streaked face came into view in the harsh fluorescence. Her hair was cut short, dirty blonde, and her face was covered in bruises. Her nose looked broken, and her lip was split. The blood trickled down her face like red tears, and then mingled with actual tears as they fell to the damp earth. I sighed, looking at Stein as the gun stayed at the ready. "What the hell is this?" Stein looked surprised. "It's an asset. TJ said you handled these for us. Handle the asset." "This is a freaking kid. Barely old enough to wipe her own butt. What could she have possibly done?" Stein's face was stony. "Yours is not a question, soldier. Liquidate this asset, or be liquidated." I looked up at the kid, her whole face shaking as the tears and blood fell, and thought about watching her head pop like a grape. This wasn't some scared adult, some stoic old man, some praying woman, or some cursing thing with sallow skin. This was a kid. I'd killed lots of people, more in my time here than I ever had during the war, but I was still a professional, and professionals had standards. "No," I said. Stein blinked. "What?" "No, I won't kill a kid. Do it yourself." The two men drew their guns, and I was transported back to the first time. I was standing there, 2 days after Christmas, watching TJ grin and tell me the rules. Now I was standing in the woods, the autumn leaves carpeting the ground, feeling sure that it would soon drink both my blood and the girl's. "I will give you to the count of 3 to kill the girl. After that point you will both be executed. 1. Their guns were unwavering, but so was my resolve. 2. I closed my eyes, preparing to die. 3. I heard a sound like wet concrete splitting open. It was followed by a high-pitched scream and a pair of bodies hitting the ground. I opened my eyes and saw Stein running towards the town car, his composure gone. The two men who had been holding me at gunpoint were bleeding out on the ground from large grizzly neck wounds. As I watched Stein run, a rust-red something snapped out and caught him in the back of the neck, dropping him inches from the town car. The red something protruded from the front of his neck, and he grasps futilely at it as he died. I looked back in the direction the thing had snapped out from, and saw the girl was now a mass of red spikes, segmented like spider legs. Her face had split long ways, forcing her to the face of a grizzly, sideways maw. The area between the teeth glowed a deep red, and I could see the eyes on the girl's face blinking erratically, the two halves of her smile grinning at me, and the effect was a little dizzying. I figured for the second time that day I was going to die, but she scuttled off into the woods instead, walking on her strange spider appendages as she crashed through the trees. I stood there for a few minutes, not quite sure I believed I wasn't dead, and then I started running too. I crashed through the woods for hours, running in no particular direction, sure that at any minute a creature or a helicopter from 2 trees would fall on me and either rip me apart or blow me away. I had blundered off with no wallet, no cell, and just my gun and the clothes I'd been wearing. Was the phone how they tracked me? TJ hadn't said as much, but maybe. When the ground went out from under me, I felt the air drop out of my lungs. I fell 5 feet off a mud ledge and skidded my hand. My knees hurt when I landed on them, and I realized pretty quickly that I had fallen onto a road. I thought it might be an illusion. The headlights that pinned me to the ground a moment later left me with little doubt. I was kind of numb to the idea of dying by this point, and just lay there waiting to be run down. Thankfully, the truck stopped, and after a short conversation with the driver, he offered to take me into town. And that's how I came to be here, in this dingy little hotel that happens to have a computer in the lobby. I sold the gun for about $500, and I figure I'll disappear as soon as I'm done writing this. They know I'm gone by now, but I don't know if they think I'm dead or they think I fled. Either way, they'll find me, I'm sure. I'm more worried about that little girl that's loose in the woods, and whatever it is that's living beneath the surface of her skin. If you see a young girl with short, dirty blonde hair, do not approach her. I don't know if she killed those men to get away, or if she killed them because she wanted to, but she should be considered dangerous if you encounter her in the wild. And if a man from 2 trees offers you a job, do not become the new curator for Black Site 7. The job is definitely not all it appears to be. Goodbye.
I hope you enjoyed. Please like and subscribe, it helps the channel a lot. See you next time.